The moment my parents demanded that I extend a staggering loan to my sister, I felt my lungs constrict, as if the air itself had grown too thick to breathe. They spoke in careful, measured tones that made their request sound almost routine, but there was a fervent gleam in their eyes, an unspoken insistence that I comply no matter what. My sister hovered nearby, gaze flickering between them and me, the tiniest hint of desperation tugging at her features. I couldn't ignore the question thrumming through my mind: how had this become my problem? Still, the pressure in the room was palpable. When I opened my mouth and refused, their shock and anger radiated like a physical force, and that's when my phone buzzed, slicing through the tension with an ominous ring. I never imagined my life would spiral into a standoff with my own parents. As a child, I'd grown up in a modest household. We weren't exactly wealthy, but we weren't poor either. My father worked long hours, my mother handled most of the household tasks, and I spent a fair chunk of my childhood practicing the piano or reading mystery novels. My sister, only a year younger than me, was the more rebellious one, sneaking out to meet friends, forging our parents' signatures on school forms, and flirting with the idea of traveling the world on a whim. Despite our differences, we were close for a while, bound by the shared routines of daily life. But all that changed when we entered adulthood. By the time I reached my mid-20s, I'd saved enough to launch my own small venture. I poured myself into making it grow, endless hours, sleepless nights, all fueled by a stubborn sense that I had to succeed. Luck met determination. Gradually, my company expanded, forging partnerships, building a respectable reputation. While I was steering my career into a stable place, my sister seemed to slip into one questionable decision after another. She chased fleeting job opportunities, dated a string of people who either drained her bank account or left her heartbroken, and ultimately teetered between precarious gigs. When she finally found a job that hinted at security, she quit it within months, claiming she felt stifled. She'd show up at my doorstep unannounced, crash for a few nights, then vanish with the wind. For years it was a pattern I grew accustomed to. But now the stakes were higher. This wasn't about letting her borrow a few hundred for groceries or covering a late rent payment. My parents, and she, were pressuring me to dispense a huge sum that, at one point, represented nearly everything I'd earned. I saw it as a moral hazard. If she had never learned to manage smaller amounts, how could she handle a sum so large she'd be in debt for decades? My parents, however, had a counterargument: family. They believed I owed it to her, that blood ties trumped financial caution. They sat me down in our old living room, the same place I once watched Saturday morning cartoons, and insisted I step up to save her. I remember the hush that gripped the room when I said no. My mother's hands clenched on her lap, and my father's expression hardened. My sister's eyes brimmed with shock, as if she never considered I might refuse. A twisted sense of guilt gnawed at me. I still loved them, I wanted them to approve of me, but I also needed to protect what I'd built. And let's be honest, I was furious. Furious that no one bothered to ask how I felt, or whether I was comfortable risking so much. Furious that they assumed I'd fold because apparently that was my familial duty. I left that confrontation with a pounding headache, frustration boiling in my veins. Not even an hour later, as I was pacing my apartment trying to calm down, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but in my agitated state, I picked up without thinking. The voice on the other end greeted me politely. It was a woman. She introduced herself as someone connected to my sister, an attorney, she claimed, though her tone was oddly personal, as if she knew me in ways no random lawyer should. She mentioned she'd heard about my reluctance to help out. The conversation was coated with unsettling insinuations. Something about how families thrive on trust, how it'd be a shame if certain private matters became public knowledge. In short, it sounded like a threat masked in civility. I hung up, my heart hammering. I had no idea what skeletons she might claim to reveal, and I hated the notion that my sister was stooping to blackmail me through a third party. My thoughts raced. Maybe it was a bluff, a scare tactic. But that small part of me that worried about how image and reputation can be twisted by rumors wouldn't let me ignore the possibility. I spent hours that night going through every single memory, every detail of my life. Were there any old business deals that could be spun as scandalous? Any rumor that might sabotage my company? Days later, my parents called me to come over for a serious talk, so I obliged. Stepping into my childhood home, I noticed how it felt more claustrophobic than ever. My father's brow was furrowed in anger, my mother's features crumpled in anxiety. My sister was there too, perched on the sofa, looking somehow both defiant and desperate. They told me in no uncertain terms that I was tearing the family apart. My mother pleaded, Would I really jeopardize relationships just to cling to my wealth? Her eyes, usually so warm, brimmed with disappointment. Something inside me snapped at that. I retorted that no one asked me how I felt, that I was just supposed to fork over a fortune and trust my sister to repay it someday, though her history spoke otherwise. My father slammed his fist on the table, demanding respect, telling me that families stick together, that we never turn our backs on one another. I shot back that maybe families also consider each other's well-being and not just the demands of one desperate member. The argument escalated into shouting, my voice cracking with pent-up emotions, my mother weeping, my father seething. My sister remained oddly silent, glancing at me with an almost unreadable expression. Storming out, I realized I might have truly crossed a line. My parents had always believed in unity. In their eyes, I was an ungrateful child who'd chosen money over kin. But to me, I was defending my autonomy. I was tired of enabling my sister's reckless behavior. Yet the threat from that mysterious phone call lingered in my mind. Was my sister orchestrating something behind the scenes? Or was it my parents trying a new tactic to push me into compliance? I tried to focus on my work in the following days, but the tension gnawed at me. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, some scandal, some rumor. My office staff sensed my unease, but I brushed off their concerns. Then, in a bizarre twist, I got an email from a reporter at a small local news site. They wanted a comment about a rumor that I might be under investigation for fraudulent business practices. My blood ran cold. Fraud? I'd never done anything of the sort. The reporter's tone suggested they'd already heard allegations from an anonymous tip. They asked if I had a statement. It was the exact scenario I dreaded, a hint that maybe my sister or the woman who'd called me was feeding lies to the media. I wrote back immediately, asserting my innocence, providing references and documentation. The reporters seemed a bit sheepish when I sent them all the data that refuted the claim. They eventually conceded that it might have been a baseless tip. But the damage was done. Someone was trying to sabotage me. My parents? My sister? Or was it just a friend of hers acting out? The confusion and anger thickened with each passing hour. I confronted my sister directly. I called her cell phone and to my surprise, she answered. I demanded to know if she was behind the rumor. At first, she feigned ignorance, claiming she had no idea what I was talking about. But I pressed on, telling her about the phone call from the so-called attorney, about the reporter's inquiry. She stammered, insisting she'd never stooped to that. I wanted to believe her. She might be irresponsible with money, but malicious sabotage didn't align with the sister I grew up with. Then again, desperation drives people to extremes. We ended the conversation with no clear resolution. My sister sounded genuinely distressed, but I couldn't tell if it was guilt or frustration at being accused. Either way, I was alone in dealing with the ramifications. For the first time in my life, I truly comprehended how money can fracture even the closest families. The existence of that large sum turned me into a target. Or maybe it revealed fault lines that had always been there, waiting for the right amount of pressure to break them open. My father, in the meantime, doubled down on his stance. He left me voice messages that began with a semblance of civility and ended with hints of estrangement. If you don't help your sister, you can forget coming here for the holidays. My mother wrote me tearful texts saying she raised me to be kind, to support others, so how could I be so heartless? The emotional manipulation rained down from all sides. Each message felt like a fresh wound. Exhausted by the pressure, I sought advice from a couple of trusted friends. One suggested I issue a formal statement saying I was not funding my sister's needs, that any rumors about my finances or wrongdoing were false. Another friend recommended I take a step back, talk to a lawyer, and maybe consider a minimal loan if it would quell the chaos. But I knew that if I gave in, it wouldn't solve anything. My sister would see it as an invitation to request more later, or fail to repay it, leaving me resentful all over again. The blackmail, if that's what it was, would continue too. In that swirl of confusion, I felt anger, sadness, a measure of guilt, and above all, a kind of deep betrayal by my own flesh and blood. One night, I decided to call my sister again, ignoring the bristling tension, determined to have a real conversation. She picked up, sounding tired. I cut straight to the chase. Is this you? Are you the one trying to spread rumors? For a moment, silence hung heavy between us. Then quietly she said she had no idea who might be doing it. She confessed that her financial hole was deeper than she'd ever revealed. She owed massive debts to multiple people, and a friend of hers, someone she once confided in, might have turned manipulative, looking for any angle to force my hand. She promised she hadn't told them to do anything malicious. I sighed, torn between relief that she might be telling the truth and fear that her chaotic life had drawn in some opportunistic predator. A part of me wanted to ask about her plan for repaying a loan so massive. But I didn't. Instead, I told her to keep me posted on any more suspicious activity, and we ended the call on a note that was half reconciliatory, half uneasy. The next day, I received a letter at my office. No return address, typed text, almost like a ransom note you'd see in a movie. It was short: "Your sister needs the money. Do it or face more consequences." My hand shook. This was definitely more serious than a simple family drama. Now I was dealing with an actual threat. I called the police, filed a report, but they said they had limited leads. The detective I spoke to advised me to keep the letter, watch for more evidence, maybe even consider installing security cameras at my home. I ended that conversation feeling both foolish and terrified. How had my life turned into this? Still, part of me refused to cave. I started imagining all the ways my sister's mess could get worse if I surrendered. The sum was astronomically high. I pictured her indulging in short-sighted decisions, piling up even more debt. I pictured myself permanently locked into a cycle of bailing her out. My parents might sigh with relief, pat me on the back for doing the right thing, but at what cost? My independence, my hard-earned stability? In the midst of that turmoil, I did something I hadn't done in a while: visited my parents in person, unannounced. My father opened the door, his expression darkening when he saw me. My mother hovered behind him, eyes red from crying. I quietly asked if we could sit and talk. No yelling, no accusations, just talk. They agreed, albeit with reluctance. We settled in the living room. The tension was thick. My mother started to speak, her voice trembling, repeating the same arguments about family. My father tried to keep calm but ended up lecturing me about loyalty. I let them speak. Then I laid out my perspective. I told them about the threatening phone call, the suspicious attorney, the letter, and the reporter sniffing around. Their faces paled. They insisted they had nothing to do with any blackmail or rumor-mongering. My father looked genuinely appalled at the notion. My mother started shaking her head, repeating that none of them would harm me in that way. So who else wants this money so badly that they'd stoop to intimidation? I asked, voice hollow. My parents exchanged a glance. Then my mother admitted that my sister had been involved with some unsavory people, short-term lenders with questionable practices. She might have mentioned that I was well off, that I could rescue her. Maybe those people decided to turn up the heat. My father's face twisted in guilt. He realized that by pushing me, they'd effectively put me in the crosshairs of whoever was after my sister's debt repayment. They apologized haltingly for pressuring me. My mother tearfully added that she just couldn't stand seeing one child flourish while another sank. But she hadn't realized how dangerous it had become. That talk marked a turning point. I felt a wave of complicated emotions: relief that my parents might not have been behind the threats, anger at my sister for involving criminals, fear for my own safety. Over the next few days, my mother texted me updates that she'd gleaned from my sister. Apparently, she owed a large sum to a friend of a friend who dabbled in shady lending. That person was now desperate to recoup and had latched onto me as the golden goose. My sister, in her naive desperation, had let slip that I had the resources to bail her out. I considered a range of strategies. Should I pay off her lender directly? That felt like feeding a shark. Should I ignore the threats and let my sister deal with the consequences? That felt cold-blooded. Or maybe I could offer a partial solution, cover some essential portion of her debt so she'd be safe, but not grant her free rein over my finances. None of these solutions felt entirely right. But ignoring the situation wasn't an option anymore, not with potential criminals harassing me. Eventually, I scheduled a meeting with an attorney of my own, someone who specialized in financial disputes and protective orders. We discussed the possibility of drafting a legal agreement where I'd cover only a portion of my sister's debt, pay it directly to the lender under strict conditions, and have her sign a contract to repay me in structured installments. My attorney also suggested involving law enforcement more heavily if the intimidation continued. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a blueprint for containing the chaos. On some level, I recognized that once criminals smelled money, the situation could escalate unpredictably. The next challenge was persuading my sister to go along with this. She showed up at my place looking frazzled, hair in a messy ponytail, shadows under her eyes. She apologized for how far things had gone. She seemed genuinely terrified of the people she owed. She claimed she never wanted me dragged into it. She'd only mentioned me as a possible last resort, not imagining they'd strong-arm me. I wanted to trust her words. I also knew she had a track record of bending the truth when cornered. But seeing her so visibly afraid, I felt a pang of compassion. I outlined my proposal. I'd pay a fraction, specifically the part that covered the principal she owed these people, and not a penny more. The rest, any interest or fees they tacked on, she'd have to negotiate or find another way to handle. We'd set up a binding repayment structure with monthly installments. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes, whispering gratitude. We didn't hug or break into tearful confessions. The rift between us was still fresh. But at least we had a step forward. I told her that if we discovered more intimidation tactics, we'd involve the authorities. She agreed. After that, the arrangement was set in motion. My attorney contacted the lender's representative, someone with a shady background but apparently eager to get their money. We hammered out a contract that was borderline black and white in its legality, but enough to keep them from harassing us further. I placed the funds in escrow under the condition that they cease all forms of intimidation. My sister signed a promissory note. My parents, oddly subdued, stayed out of the negotiations but thanked me repeatedly. I felt a mixture of relief, resentment, and exhaustion. In the weeks that followed, the harassment stopped. No more letters, no more mysterious phone calls. The reporter who'd inquired about fraud vanished, presumably finding no juicy story. Life began slipping back into a semblance of normal. Yet the emotional fallout lingered. I'd lost some measure of trust in my sister, and she sensed it. We spoke occasionally, about everyday things, about how she was now trying to find stable work to repay me. We kept it polite. Neither of us mentioned that horrifying phone call or the monstrous sum that nearly tore the family apart. My parents tried to mend fences. My mother, always the peacemaker, invited me over for dinner. I went reluctantly, half expecting to feel suffocated by the memory of that awful confrontation. But it was surprisingly calm. My father apologized for pushing me so hard, explaining that he worried about my sister's well-being, that he hated seeing me succeed alone while she struggled. I told him that my success was hard-earned, that I never begrudged my sister a helping hand, but I resented feeling cornered. He nodded, looking older and more tired than I ever remembered. Since then we've been in a fragile truce. I don't regret refusing the initial request. I do regret how ugly it became, how it revealed aspects of my family dynamic I wish I'd never seen. My sister and I check in with each other here and there. She's been sending me small monthly payments as agreed, but it'll be a long road for her. Whether she learns from this or falls into more reckless choices is out of my hands. At least I can say I tried to balance compassion with caution. That moment when I refused, prompting an ominous phone call, was the start of a harrowing chapter in my life. Yet maybe it was necessary. Without it, I'd have remained oblivious to the depths of my sister's entanglements, the cunning nature of the people she owed, or even my parents' misguided desperation. Sometimes families shield their darkest secrets until money rips the veil away. Maybe that's the real tragedy, that it took a potential financial meltdown to force everyone to confront their flaws. Still, I learned something crucial. No matter how much you love your family, your own boundaries matter. Sacrificing your peace, your safety, and your livelihood under the guise of duty isn't always the noble path. Sometimes you have to stand firm, even if it means weathering heartbreak and betrayal. I'm not entirely sure what the future holds for my sister, or how my relationship with my parents will evolve. But I do know I won't blindly follow their demands again. I won't let guilt or threats dictate my actions. My loyalty has limits, and that's okay. There are days I glance at my phone, half expecting another unsettling ring, or an anonymous letter demanding more. My heart still twinges with the memory of that threat. But so far, quiet has prevailed. My sister's debt to me remains a fragile thread between us. Maybe in time we'll rebuild a healthier bond. Maybe this will be the catalyst for her to finally straighten out her life, find stability, and not rely on ephemeral windfalls. Or maybe I'll forever see her as the sibling who nearly pulled me under with her. Only time will tell. For now, I wake each morning, focus on my business, chat with friends, and try to put the fiasco behind me. My parents occasionally ask how I'm doing. I keep my answers brief, civil. I sense they're waiting for the day I come around and treat them as I did before any of this happened. But the truth is, I've changed. My eyes are more open. I see the cracks in our family dynamic that I once overlooked. And while it hurts, it's also liberating to recognize that I can care for them without sacrificing my own well-being. In the end, that phone call served as a brutal wake-up. It forced me to confront how easily trust can be shattered by desperation, how swiftly the line between love and manipulation can blur. Yet, ironically, it also pushed me to define my boundaries in a way I never had. I realized I can still want to help without letting myself be trampled. Perhaps that's the hardest lesson life can teach. That love without limits can become a weapon wielded against you, even by those you hold dear. I still have moments when I reflect on the entire ordeal and feel a stab of bitterness. But bitterness alone isn't productive. I try to direct that energy into caution, into forging a future where I'm mindful of where I invest my resources, emotional and financial. If my sister truly turns a corner, I'll be there to cheer her on, but I won't enable her. If my parents approach me with more demands, I'll calmly remind them of my boundaries. It's not the fairy tale vision of family unity, but it's more honest than the illusions we once held. Sometimes that honesty is all you can cling to. Because behind the veneer of bright family gatherings and forced smiles, real life can be messy, filled with heartbreak and moral dilemmas. Maybe that's what it means to grow up, to realize that even the people who love you the most can place you in impossible positions, and it's on you to navigate them without losing your sense of self. I'm still here, still standing, still breathing. My sister is out there, hopefully avoiding the pitfalls she once fell into. My parents remain in our old house, trying to patch up the emotional aftermath. And me? I'm no hero nor a villain. Just someone who refused a request that felt wrong, who endured the resulting storm, and who now knows, in the harshest sense, that money can corrode or clarify relationships. We choose which. I think I've chosen clarity, painful though it may be. So I continue forward, stronger, warier, but oddly at peace. Because at least now I can look in the mirror and recognize that I stood up for what I believed in. Even when confronted with guilt trips and threats, I didn't buckle entirely. I found a compromise that protected me and offered a route for my sister to recover. If that's not a perfect ending, it's at least a realistic one. And in a family saga fueled by debts and demands, realism might be the best outcome any of us can hope for.